Hello, very good to have you along. In 2015, world leaders committed to the ambitious aim of, quote, eradicating poverty in all of its forms by 2030. At the start of this new decade, is it possible or preposterous? This is Roundtable. And a very warm welcome from me, David Foster, and my guest, plus the Roundtable crystal ball, because in this programme we are looking into the not-so-distant future and a fairer world, it is hoped, for the very poorest. For the latest in our 2020 Vision series, we wonder whether it is possible to really end poverty.
In 2015, the UN put together the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 with ambitious targets to eradicate poverty. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as living on less than $1.90 a day. The majority of those who do live in sub-Saharan Africa. According to the UN, more than 700 million people, or 10% of the world population, still live in extreme poverty and are struggling to fulfill the most basic needs like health, education, and access to water and sanitation. Poverty has many dimensions, making it hard to measure, but its causes include unemployment, social exclusion, and high vulnerability of certain populations because of disasters and diseases. Are the UN goals to end poverty by 2030 unrealistic, and do anti-poverty programs need restructuring to help those most in need?
With me today, Saqib Jaffrey, Professor of Development Economics, who believes we need to look at factors such as climate change, health and education when we're talking poverty. Moiza Binad Sawais from the Overseas Development Institute and says anti-poverty programs need to invest in people right at the very bottom. Homi Karas from the Brookings Institute joins us. He's advised the UN Secretary General on poverty, and Christopher Hamill from the World Data Lab. Thank you very much indeed. Chris, World Data Lab, I'm holding in my hands what's called the World Poverty Clock. 604,404,968, 7, 6, 5. And it says the number of people who will be leaving poverty per second is 1/2 of one person. In other words, 1 every 2 seconds. You've got a target of 3 times that. How close are you towards that goal?
Well, I'm afraid progress has been made and progress will continue to be made, but we will be unlikely to hit the target of completely eradicating extreme poverty by the end of the 2030 target period.
Why is that?
Well, essentially, we've seen a lot of poverty reduction, a lot of momentum for poverty reduction over the last decade or so come out of the rising fortunes largely of Asia. To cut a long story short, most of the people living in extreme poverty in Asia have now been lifted out of poverty. And so the poverty story of China and of India largely, not completely, but largely comes to a close. And the challenge now really focuses in on sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, I'll come back to you because there's lots of different elements to your clock, and I'd like to talk about Africa in more detail later. Homi, I always like to get people who are away from the studio into the discussion early on. When it comes to the $1.90 a day, which is supposed to indicate the level at which people can or cannot live properly, live in poverty or don't live in poverty. I mean, that doesn't really tell very much of a story, does it?
Well, it tells you a story about people living in what we call absolute deprivation. When you have less than $1.90 per day to spend, you're basically operating on the margins of survival. You're not able to save anything. You're not able to invest anything. The chances of your children having a decent education or even living to their full life is very low. So I think it actually does mean quite a lot. It basically means, are you going to live as a human being with aspirations and hopes for yourself and your family? Yeah. Or are you simply going to live?
Help me with this one, though, because $1.90 in the United States, or this country, the UK, isn't going to go very far. But in a poor community in Africa, it would go a lot further. That's what I'm trying to say, is it doesn't tell... Well, okay, it tells a story, but not the whole story.
So these numbers are supposedly adjusted to take into account differences in cost of living in different places. So actually $1.90 in the United States and $1.90 in Nigeria are, roughly speaking, the same amount in terms of what they contribute. Of course, the United States has defined its own poverty line at a level which is substantially higher than that in Nigeria, but that's a matter of society's preferences rather than a matter of what is absolutely necessary for people to live.
Moise, look, yeah, please add what you want to do there, then I've got a question.
Thanks, Omi. I think I just wanted to come in and say that the $1.90 a day as an international poverty measure is just one measure, right? And it's a measure of the least we could do, the least the world can do. You can have someone who might not be living under $1.90 a day by global poverty measure, but still be very much poor within its own nation, a person within their own nation. The World Bank has adjusted to come up with comparable poverty lines. You have a poverty line for the lower middle income countries, which is about $3.20 a day. You have one for upper middle income countries, which is $5.50 a day.
Okay, so it's not perfect, but it is the best we've got. I'd like to take a look at the fact that the number of people in poverty, as we've seen from the World Poverty Clock, is falling at the same time as the number of middle-class people is rising. And I'm wondering if, in fact, what we're seeing is the middle class and the wealthier getting to become better off at the expense of those at the other end of the scale.
Actually, I wouldn't use the word at the expense because that's fairly loaded. But it is true that there's growing inequality. And one could even argue that the middle class might itself, globally at least, be on the wrong side of that increasing inequality. What I do think is a problem, and we were discussing this earlier, is that a lot of governments in Asia and Africa still have this view of development as being something top-down and stimulated best through growth. And that does tend to favor the middle class at the expense of the very poor. So one of the things that, that I believe is important is to have a bottom-up approach to development. And countries like Bangladesh, by the way, have shown, in Sri Lanka, that by investing first in reducing poverty and generally expanding social security and education and health more widely.
And this is the ground level stuff. This is the bottom up.
This is the bottom up approach. That by improving social indicators, now they have been reaping the benefits because Bangladesh is now a very rapidly growing economy. My view is that that has happened because they have invested first in their people.
Yeah, Chris, I was going to come to you on this one. I think the figures, I can't dial it up at the moment, but that's down to me, not your clock. I think the figures for Africa as a whole are about 34% in poverty, correct?
So 34% of the entire continent, sub-Saharan and Saharan, is living in extreme poverty. But if we look at what that percentage means for the total people living in extreme poverty worldwide, it's a much higher number. It's in the high 70s. So Africa now represents most of the people living in extreme poverty. And by the end of 2030, that will just go up. So the number will fall, the absolute number will fall, but the percentage it represents will increase to the 80s area.
Yeah, and Asia's touted as a relative success story. Africa is at the other end of the scale. So 2 questions, and this could be for anybody, but I'll start with you, Chris. Why is that, and what can be done about it?
Sure. So we see a couple factors coming at play all at once in Africa, creating this environment where there are a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa with significant populations now falling back into poverty. That means not only are they not shedding poverty, but they're actually adding poor people daily rather than shedding them. And Nigeria is one of the countries we point to where there is a massive population boom, specifically what's called the youth bulge, where you have the lower end of the demographic spectrum being added to the ranks of the poor, and there aren't enough jobs and not enough growth to be able to absorb all these additional people that are essentially being born into very poor households.
Okay, and let's go to Hamia, because I see that Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, African countries, others as well, but those 4 African countries are said to be relatively successful. So that goes back to my question, what can be done about what is happening in Africa, if they are a good example or not?
Well, I think that when you look at Africa, you have to recognize that Africa is actually a very diverse continent. So when we talk about the numbers of people living in poverty in Africa, that in turn is concentrated in a few places. It's going to be Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, places like that. These are fairly large countries. They have not been doing very well economically.
Okay, we seem to have lost Homi for just a moment, but Moiser, I know you were sort of keen to say something. Come back to you in a moment, Homi. We lost the connection for just a few seconds.
No, I was just going to say that the kind of research that I do, which is looking particularly at bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, the population that are left behind, it doesn't. It's not so much that there are no priorities, no articulated priorities by government within Africa towards these populations. It's that the investments that seem to supposedly go towards bringing people out of poverty don't really have a link with them. It's kind of like going back to what you're saying, it's top down. This idea that somehow trickle down will just happen, as opposed to having a real theory of right. So if we're investing in the oil sector, which you shouldn't be doing, but okay, if you are, how exactly is it changing or creating jobs for the poorest?
But equally, you could say without the income from oil, and I know a lot of it is siphoned off in the wrong way, but without the income from oil, you wouldn't be able to invest in those at the bottom.
Sure, but and that is a question of trade-offs, which I think people at the UN are definitely dealing with. I'm more concerned about countries that don't have the resource, but feel they have the investment. So infrastructure-heavy projects that I don't think you have enough oil to justify going into there, but it's infrastructure brings money, or leads to kind of deals with your economic elites within your own countries that then makes your power stay longer.
Let's turn it around a little bit, and you may have something you want to add anyway, Zeki, but let's turn it around a little bit and say, are there areas of the world that those that aren't being successful at the moment can look to learn lessons and see how perhaps they could bring an example from one particular corner of the globe back to a country in Africa?
Okay. Well, if I may answer that question by going back to the 60s, which is that at the time, there was this sort of newly independent countries coming onto the world stage, and the focus of development was very much on promoting growth through sort of diversifying your economy, and it was all sort of macro level growth. Korea was one of the success stories to come out of that very early on, but one of the and one reason why they did that was they adopted the right set of macroeconomic strategies, right, which was relying on markets and sort of being fairly open with relationship to the world. But at the same time, they were also investing very heavily in education and health and creating an educated workforce. And without that, a skilled workforce. So without that base, they would not have succeeded in the industrial strategy. A lot of literature has been generated on this question, So I would say that currently, the role models, I think, at least for our part, the part of Asia where I come from and which I'm very interested in, South Asia, are countries like Bangladesh, Indonesia, which it's not that they are like socialist countries just promoting redistribution and poverty reduction. They're open, but they combine that with investments in health and education, and so. For Africa, I would say that Botswana is supposed to be a very good sort of example of resource-based economies using their mineral riches to create a more diversified sort of, social infrastructure.
Yeah. Isn't it just an indication of how overly ambitious this idea of eradicating poverty by 2030 actually is, that we've gone from the Far East through South Asia, into sub-Saharan Africa. We haven't mentioned parts of South America yet, but we could do. This is a problem with no one particular shade of color in it, and that begs the question, does it not, that poverty is always going to be with us in one shape or another?
That's not true, and there's no reason why it should be. Global wealth is increasing. So I don't understand why something as bare minimum as $1.90. $1.90, which by most accounts we wouldn't be able to survive on, or most people. That's a very easy measure. The fact that you can't go to zero on this by 2030 says something quite fundamental about who's poor and constantly poor, and why they're just never a priority.
Why are they never a priority, Chris?
Well, I think part of this story is the rural element. I mean, if we look at Africa, 43% of the population poor, or more than 305 million people live in rural poverty in Africa. So they live on the margins of society, also often have little political influence, aren't connected to major markets. So essentially, they're quite marginalized, and they will increasingly represent the world's poorest. So when you're asking about interventions, I think the priorities need to be, how do we connect these people to markets? How do we get services to them? And also, how do we recognize that smaller secondary settlements will evolve over the next 10 years and start to become cities in their own right due to this youth bulge in Africa? I think if we can bear these in mind, it'll take us a long way.
Yeah, I talk about the attitude of richer countries here, per se, Hami, partly because you and Chris co-authored a paper for the Brookings Institute. One of the things that I noted from it was you said it is harder to hold higher income countries to account. And I wondered what you meant by that.
Well, usually poverty is taken care of by governments in their own countries. But in very poor countries, those governments simply don't have the resources to take care of their own people. And historically, there's been a commitment by the richer countries of the world to do their share to help those governments take care of their own people. Increasingly, what we're finding is that the richer countries of the world are no longer that interested in doing that. The amounts of money that they devote to helping poorer countries reduce poverty are no longer commensurate with the scale of resources that would be needed in order to actually bring poverty down to zero. As was said before, it's something which is financially feasible. It's technologically feasible. The money exists. We're probably talking about no more than an extra maybe $200 billion a year, a very small sum when you think about a global economy, which is $80 trillion in size. But it's extremely difficult to actually mobilize that funding politically.
Well, if it is that number, that is roughly half of, or twice as what it would cost apparently to build a railway line in this country that is debatable or not. So the question is, why are countries, richer countries, no longer seemingly that willing to put their hands in their pockets or to question their consciences? And does that not now make the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal much more difficult to achieve?
I'm not so sure, though, that I agree with I think with the consensus of everybody here that it's probably going to be hard to achieve that goal by 2030. I do believe it is achievable, not by 2030, but at some point. I'm not so sure that the aid and assistance from the rich countries, while it is very desirable, should be seen as a key reason why it can't be achieved.
But now, the suggestion was that richer countries are less willing now than they perhaps
that is
were
also
a generation
true.
ago.
Yeah, that is also true, but I think that has to do with the change in the political climate of the rich countries. And that, again, is partly because of the, what goes around comes around. So now you have large populations of displaced and conflict-affected people who have been trying to get into the rich countries. And that has generated a populist. I'm not a political scientist, but that seems to have created this populist backlash, which then rebounds back on the attitudes of the rich countries. So I think we're part of a big global drama in this, but that does not mean that we cannot, at local levels and at national levels, try to address these issues.
So many different areas, are there not, to poverty as such? But one thing that shocked me when I read it, around 45% of deaths of children under 5 are linked to undernutrition. In other words, they are not in a position, they or their parents, to provide enough food for them. That is one extreme end of poverty. 45% of the deaths of children under 5.
And I think children definitely is like one sort of one group or proportion of people that we think about when we talk about the left behind, because it's not easy to measure it for them. They can live, sometimes poor children can live within very rich households. And that's one of the issues that you have with the way that poverty can sometimes be measured. And the issue that we have with trying to get data for left behind populations is there are certain markers that are associated with vulnerability: gender, people with disabilities, ethnicity, race, etc. Some of them can be captured when you measure a household in the household head, but sometimes these people can be living within a household and not have access. I mean, the UK yourself, it's, as I said, so surprising. Child poverty has actually risen by 1%, although absolute income poverty has stayed the same. So the average has been hiding a lot of disparity that comes from different markers of identity.
Okay,
so
what we've seen is an ambitious target which is perhaps attainable but not necessarily in the time that is there. The more well-off countries are now probably less willing than they were a generation ago to do something about this, which may say something about the nature of politics worldwide. And we have all of these child deaths. We have areas that need to be concentrated on. Here is another one. The Food and Agricultural Organization reckons that agricultural production needs to at least double by 25 to prevent even more food shortages and therefore even more food deaths. And Chris, I'm going to come to you just because you're looking as though you want to reinforce this point.
I appreciate that. Yeah, 2 points. First, we've actually been commissioned to develop a hunger model, and Homi and I are working with our team now over the rest of this year to launch a hunger model and clock that will try to address this point exactly and get a little bit more definition for exactly these kind of discussions, and that should come out this fall. I also wanted to just support the idea of children, and what I can add to it is on the clock you're actually able to filter by age, and if you do so you'll see that by our estimates more than half or about half or more than half, depending on the definition, of people living in extreme poverty are in fact children under the age of 20. So it is indeed a dire situation for the younger generations, particularly in Africa. And with climate shocks and food insecurity looming, there is reason to need to try to find solutions and to do them quickly.
Okay. And the number of male versus female who are living in extreme poverty, pretty much roughly the same from what I've seen from your clock. But you are preparing a paper, the two of you, and I'm going to come to you for this one, Hamid. I think we're going to get out later this month. So we'll have a heads up on Roundtable first about the extremes of rural poverty.
Yes, so poverty has always been concentrated in rural areas, and it poses very specific challenges because these are areas where the reach of governments and public policy is actually most difficult. They tend to be far away, they tend to be more sparsely populated, and so the unit costs of delivering services in rural areas tends to be higher than in urban areas. So we really need to know and understand where people are. And ultimately, I think what we're trying to do with the poverty clock and with these measures of urban and rural poverty is to move away from talking about poverty in terms of the big numbers and really starting to say, here are concentrations of poor people in specific geographic areas. Those are the places where we have to focus our attention.
And is it your job to tell the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who's worked, of course, with many poor people in his role with refugees, is it your job to tell him, or one of the things you do, to say, concentrate on the individuals, the bottom of the pyramid, as has been suggested here?
I think the UN has already adopted that posture. They're very keen to focus on the poorest of the poor. But up until now, it's been very difficult to actually get the data and information about where these people are. Just simply saying they're in a particular country, say Nigeria, doesn't tell you all that much. It tells you something, but it certainly doesn't tell you the whole story or even perhaps the most important part of the story.
Okay, I'm going to come to Moise for a final word because you wanted to say something about that. Thank you very much indeed, We don't have much time.
Okay, just to quickly say that on Homi's point, that I think it's going to be very hard to get governments to actually pay attention to those poorest of the poor, those 10 people living in some remote area, because there's very little political appetite for that kind of heavy lift. And it's very interesting, as Homi said, the UN, yes, has said that we want to reach out to the poorest of the poor, the most left behind. And yet, when you go to any of the UN forums, you'll have countries kind of using data, not having data as an excuse to not move ahead, even where they have information.
Okay, I wish we had the time. You'll have to tell me that off camera.
I will tell you.
Thank you very much indeed. I say we don't have very much time. Slightly less than 9 years in the case of this Sustainable Development Goal. 400,582,263, 262. In the course of this program, probably about 2,000 people, according to the poverty clock, have left extreme poverty. Fascinating. Loads of statistics on there. Take a look at it. worldpoverty.io. You'll find it there. Thank you very much indeed to my guests. Thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. Our 2020 Vision series continues. Do hope you can join us next time. From me, David Foster. Goodbye.